The following is a conversation about coffee, where it's grown, how its economics works, its amazing supply chain, and then all the way down to the subtleties and nuances between the different species. I was lucky enough to have this conversation with a man who is a world-class authority across all of these topics and more. His name is Ryan Delany, and he runs the Coffee Trading Academy. Ryan is a veteran of the US military, where he served as a dedicated marksman in Afghanistan in the early 2000s. After his career in the military, he then went on to be educated at Harvard under the GI Bill, and it was there where he discovered his love and passion for coffee. Ryan is both a coffee trader and an educator in the trading of this commodity coffee as well. And like we speak about in the chat, you'll hear how there is a clear distinction between the trading of a commodity and then growing or mining a commodity. This distinction informs much of his worldview and makes for an extremely realistic and objective take on coffee as an industry, coffee as a commodity versus coffee that you consume at Starbucks or coffee as it's grown in the hills of Ethiopia. This distinction between trading a commodity or growing the commodity is the key takeaway to understand Ryan's worldview here. In this chat with Ryan, again, I'm saying Ryan so many times, it feels very bizarre to do. You can hear about the following: the geography of coffee, how climate change in the environment affects the entire coffee market, the legitimacy and how seriously we should take the stamps of the Rainforest Alliance, the UTZ, or the Fair Trade, etc., the stupefying efficiency of the entire coffee supply chain. And then plus at the end, we sort of go on a sidebar about the China-US Thucydides debate on who will actually come out on top as the next superpower. Plus, there is much more as well. So if you're into coffee or the commodities biz, then you should get a lot out of this because Ryan delivers a wealth of knowledge for takeaway. And hang around the end to hear my afterthoughts from this chat, and then as well, I shall describe my ambition for the podcast. With no more from me, here is the man himself, Ryan Delany. Mr. Delaney, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon.
Pleasure.
So your bio reads that you're a coffee guy and that everyone in the industry knows what that means. For those of us outside of the industry, what are you talking about?
Sure. So first of all, you can call me Ryan. It's a strong name, good name. Might get a little confusing, but yeah. So what is a coffee guy? Maybe it's a little outdated. Maybe we should say coffee person, right? If we want to be inclusive.
Oh, come on. Coffee people.
But
sure.
yeah. No, I'm just joking. But it is valid in the sense that it is. I think I would include both genders in this. But so what is a coffee guy? Well, it's basically just people in the industry. So that would be roasters, producers, and traders. My background is on the trade side, so that I'm more biased in that sense. That's kind of where I evolved, and that's who we think about as the coffee people. Just sort of like if you have in any sort of commodity desk, and they have like oil guys or something like that, and it's all the people who they know all the oil industry and they know all that stuff. So that's what I mean by a coffee person.
So it's just knowing the industry back to front, inside and out, every angle of it, obsessed with coffee.
Yeah. Well, I have a mentor, and they told me once, I had a mentor who, when I first got in the industry, he said, Ryan, and he was like, a very suave Latin American guy. And he was like, coffee is the jealous mistress. You get in, but you never really leave, And I think what he meant by that was that there's so much information and experience that's so peculiar and focused on coffee that it's not useful anywhere else. So once you start developing all this stuff, you're just kind of that becomes what you build on that, and you it doesn't apply necessarily in a lot of other industries. So you kind of get stuck in there. It's a Hotel California. You check in, but you can never leave. So one of those things in particular is what's called cupping. And if you were looking at getting into the coffee industry at one point in your life, maybe you're familiar with this. Maybe you've done cupping. But basically, it's sensory analysis, right? So it's tasting. So cupping coffee is a skill that really, it takes years to develop, and it's years of tasting coffee on a daily basis and from all over the world. I mean, it doesn't have to be all the world. You know, you have people from Brazil or from Vietnam or whatever, and they have experience in cupping those particular coffees, and they get very good at the nuances of that. But that's just one example of like part of like the very nuanced knowledge that is not relevant anywhere else. So you kind of get sucked into this world.
I suppose that could be, or maybe you tell me, but can that sort of logic apply to any of the specific commodities? Say there might be aspects of the timber industry that is just totally nonsensical to anyone else. Or is coffee special in that way?
I think probably. I mean, part of it is our own, you know, everyone has their own sort of narcissism, and we all think that we're special, you know, in whatever way that we that we happen to be involved in. But there is also, like, you could be a metals trader, and you're not necessarily like, oh, I'm a silver guy. Like, I love silver, you know, like, so I just, you know, eat, sleep, and breathe silver. You know, maybe those people exist. I don't know, but I kind of feel like if you trade precious metals, then like you're familiar with all of those. Or if you do grains, you have grains guys. They do corn, wheat, you know, beans, whatever. So there, I think some people look at the different commodities more as like a basket. And even, you know, within those industries, you might have like corn people, especially farmers. I mean, farmers are different because farmers, you know, they, to some degree, they're loyal to the crop, but to some degree, they're like, whatever. If corn's good, I'm gonna grow corn.
But if I get a better yield from soy, I'm going over there.
Exactly, but that's not necessarily. That's certainly not true with coffee, though, because coffee, not only is it geographically kind of specific, right? And all plants are kind of geographically specific. But coffee needs to be grown. It's a tropical crop that has to be grown or grows best in the mountains. And not only that, unlike, say, wheat or corn or cotton or something, which are row crops, those are annuals, right? So every year that farmer is deciding, what should I plant here? And it's often an economic decision. It's not entirely an economic decision. As a brief aside, I've been told that American and Australian like farmers have like a bias towards planting corn, and the reason why is because they like the way corn looks. They like to go and like, you know, it's almost like a macho thing. They're like seeing this big giant crop, you know, right there. It's like satisfying them. So they, yeah. But other than that, with coffee, because it's a tree crop, you can't just pull up the trees and plant something else there, right? So if you want to plant coffee, you plant it. Even if you buy a sapling, right, a seedling that's a year old, it'll still be probably 2 or 3 years until it's producing any coffee, and 3 to 5 years before it's producing its maximum yield, you know, its primary yield. So it's a commitment from the farmer's perspective, and even the farmer as well. They have to. They're usually pretty well versed in like the quality of the crop, right? Usually, it's a generalization. It depends from region to region. And so, same with traders of coffee. You know, think of it more like wine. If you're a wine trader, you know, you're not really someone who's like, oh, I could trade wine, I could trade trinkets, I could trade, donuts. I don't know. If you trade wine, you have a specific set of like experiences and knowledge, and that's relevant to that. And there's such a range in wine as well, right? So that's kind of the ways that I would think that it's sort of unique.
And I want to get into the geo-specific breakdown of how coffee is distributed. But before I do that, you mentioned that not all cases is coffee grown at altitude. I was under the impression that was kind of a prerequisite to coffee. What is an example of it being grown at sea level?
Well, I don't know if it's grown at sea level, but in any origin that grows coffee, you have a range of altitudes. And so, for example, in Honduras, you have high-grown coffee and you have low-grown coffee, right? I don't know the exact difference between those two in terms of like the altitude. Like this coffee's only like,
so you don't know what the lower bound would be.
100 meter. No, but I've seen coffee grown in Disney World, and we had coffee grown in my office in New York.
Yeah,
we had coffee. That was so the altitude is not necessary for the plant to exist, but what the altitude does is it makes for a denser bean.
Okay.
So that is considered desirable.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so, could you, broad strokes, map of the world, how coffee settles into it? And so we've got the X amount of degrees north and south of the equator, and then in mountainous regions. Could you just break that down for us? Where is our coffee coming from?
For sure.
And tonnage amounts as well, if possible, just to give a sense of the scale of this industry.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think about the world, the globe, and I see you've got one behind you there, you have the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, and those two bands dictate the tropics, and it's basically a set amount of miles or kilometers or whatever above and below the equator. So anywhere that is tropical within that band and has mountains or higher elevated areas is going to grow coffee for the most part. By the way, did you know that there's coffee grown in Australia?
Yes, I did. I actually really want to get my hands
Northwest,
on some. But
yeah, it's a very small portion of the country.
I've never seen
in
it
the tropics
in retail. I just imagine that's because it's ridiculously expensive. But yeah, I did see. I've got this great photo. Maybe I'll send it to you after. But it was a book in a bar, in a pub I was sitting in, and it was coffee. I was like, all right, interesting. And I was just flicking through it, and then it showed this great map of the hotspots. And yeah, there was one in Australia, up in the North Queensland,
Northwest. Yeah.
So, did you try it there?
And I haven't. I've been to Australia. I took a commodity course there years ago in Melbourne. But those were mostly, cotton guys, and I think there's a lot of row crops in Australia.
It's funny, not to bring it too much on a tangent, but the cotton industry is being lambasted at the moment in Australia. It's the absolute enemy of the people. Yeah, for so long we never thought about it because we sort of knew that cotton was grown in Australia, very organic, high quality, all the X's and O's. But recently, a lot of attention's been drawn to the amount of water that's used for the cotton crops and where that water is actually coming from. And Australia is famously a drought-ridden country. I remember growing up, we had loads of water restrictions. You couldn't wash your car, for example. There were, if you watered your grass, you'd get evil eyes from all the neighbors. So in a country that's very, very strict on water, you have these huge acreages of cotton, which is an extremely water required, that's the wrong phrasing, but needs loads and loads of water. So they've actually become a bit of an enemy.
Pariah now?
Like a cultural shift.
Yeah. That's funny. I mean, I don't know the politics or even the S&D really of water, because I know that that's it's in some places that is essentially a commodity too. That's
100%.
That's either scarce or plentiful. And there's also coffee grown in South Africa too. I actually spoke with a South African who said he grows coffee. I was like, okay, that's the first. But anyway, we started with the two of the most abstract origins. That is not the coffee world. So Brazil is really the center of the coffee world, and Vietnam is the other pole, right? If we had two origins that really define coffee, but so if we're talking about size, let's say hypothetically the world grows 160 million bags of coffee, right?
Per year.
40% of that per year. 40% of that is produced in Brazil. Okay. Maybe 20% of that is produced in Vietnam. Okay. And it depends on the type of coffee too. There's Arabica and Robusta, and we can chat about that later. But Brazil is really the dominant force in the coffee world. And then the sort of historical region I'd say the traditional coffee regions from an American perspective would be Central America and Colombia. So that's where we tend to think of our coffee being grown, and it's close to us, and so that's where we get a lot of our coffees. In Europe, you're probably getting more East African coffee and Asian coffee as well. On top of that, you're also getting Brazil and Central America as well, but that's sort of how the dynamics play out. It's largely a matter of logistics, right? It's like which shipping lanes easily transport coffee to your regions, right? It's also about preferences and cost. Those are important too. So if we're talking about, so we can divide the coffee world into north and south and east and west, I guess. So in the Western Hemisphere, we have Central America, specifically what we call maybe the Super Six. So you have Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala, South Mexico, sort of Chiapas area. You have also Colombia is considered one of the milds as well, sort of in that basket. And then Brazil, as we mentioned. There's some other origins in there that also produce coffee, Peru and Ecuador and such. But those are the big ones in the Western Hemisphere. And then you have East African coffee. You have coffee grown in Kenya and Uganda, Tanzania, and the Congo. You have a little bit of West African coffee in Ivory Coast and in that area. And then you have Asia. And then in Asia, Vietnam, as I mentioned, is sort of like the workhorse of coffee. They produce, say, 30 million bags of low quality but cheap coffee that supplies a lot of the world with Robusta. And then you have Indonesia as well. So, if you think about the island of Java is a historical place where coffee has been grown, so that's where we get the word Java from, right? That's we say a cup of Java or whatever. That's based in Indonesia, and those are your primary origins. I should have mentioned in Africa also you have Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a big producer of coffee as well.
Also the home of coffee, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think Yemen, it might be considered where coffee's from, but right around that sort of
the Horn of Africa.
And yeah, and Ethiopia has a really cool coffee culture too. They have got a whole coffee ceremony there where you
really cool.
When you which I've never seen. I've never been to Ethiopia. But so that's kind of an overview of the world, and then you have the north and the south, which is important if you're a trader because the depending on where you are in relation to the equator is depends when the crop is harvested. So the northern hemisphere crops are October crops, and then the southern hemisphere crops are sort of like April, May is their harvest.
And so when I first moved to Sweden, I thought my business was going to be creating this specialty coffee brand and did a bunch of research into how it all works and so forth. It ended up going very, very cold on ice, but it was at least for a time there. I thought it would be interesting. And could you also correct my understanding of that geo-specific breakdown, that basically starting in Vietnam and then going west or east, doesn't really matter, but you basically go Robusta through Asia, then into East Africa, and then you get into the Arabica as you're coming back over to Latin America. And so could you correct if that's as a pretty broad strokes?
That's a pretty good broad strokes. So I mean, if we're talking about types of coffee, right? So or species, right? You've got the Arabica plant and you have the Robusta plant, and you have a few other secondary types of coffee that are not very popular, not very widely grown. Like there's Excelsa coffee, I think, which is like these very big, tall trees that make sort of a weird looking coffee bean, football shaped.
Interesting.
Shaped coffee
Never heard of that.
Yeah. Almost never. I've seen them once in Uganda, but for the most part, you have Arabica and Robusta, right? And so if you were a specialty interested in a specialty market, you would probably be looking at Arabicas. And so Arabica is considered the better quality coffee, the nicer tasting coffee. It's also the more sort of fickle, right? It's a little bit harder to grow. And Robusta, as the name implies, is cheaper, hardier, and easier to grow, and often grown in maybe lower grown areas. But the other interesting thing about Robusta is that it's higher in caffeine. And not only is it higher in caffeine, but I'm going deep into coffee nerd lore here.
No, that's good.
This is
yeah.
interesting. But is that Robusta also has higher concentration of oils in it, and so even though Arabica, it tends to be a nicer flavor, and people like the taste of it better, it has more acidity and all these other things, positive qualities. Robusta is actually desirable for espresso. So if you ever have an espresso, there's a little foam on the top of the espresso called the crema. And because of those oils in the Robusta, they say that it makes a nicer crema.
Interesting. Yeah, that's counterintuitive. Yeah. Because you would think that you want your espresso to be the highest quality bean that you could get your hands on.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's often a blend, so it's not only those usually, but those are desirable for that. And also, some people like a quote stronger coffee. They want more caffeine. So you'll see some of that as well.
And it's interesting to note, you said Robusta was higher in caffeine. It's almost 2x, right? It's almost double the amount of caffeine, so it's significantly higher.
That sounds right, but I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because you can just, it makes sense then what the commercial value might be for a Robusta then. If it gives you more caffeine, it's easier to grow, and it's cheaper
really about
overall.
The price, though. Yeah. I mean, I gave you some of the kind of, side interests in Robusta. And there's been movements as well to talk about, like, let's just appreciate Robusta for what it is. Let's not, so there's been talk that maybe what we think of as good coffee and good tasting coffee isn't really better. It's more just what Arabica tastes like. And maybe we should just appreciate Robusta for the way that tastes. And so there's an organization called Specialty Coffee Association. It used to be SCAAA, which is Specialty Coffee Association of America, and then they had SCAE, which is Specialty Coffee Association of Europe. But I think they might have merged. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. But at any rate, so the SCAA and the Coffee Quality Institute, CQI. So you didn't know all these crazy organizations existed, right? They have a whole criteria and process for sensory evaluation, right? We talked about cupping earlier of Arabica coffees and specialty coffees. And so they have this whole crazy little form you fill out. Now it's probably an app, but it used to be on paper, and you would score all these different sensory aspects of your specialty Arabica coffee. And so when I was in Uganda, they were experimenting with what they called an R grader. So that's a Q grader that does Arabica, right, for quality. And then the R grader, R for Robusta, they invented this new sensory evaluation form and everything for the Robustas. And so Uganda is known for their high quality Robusta, which is almost an oxymoron, but not quite. And so they invented this there, and we were evaluating these R grading forms to do a sensory evaluation. But that's a little controversial. I mean, I've talked to some specialty people about that, and they're like, "Oh, that's garbage. Robusta's terrible. Arabica's good. Like, there's a reason for that. Don't mess with it." But just give it. I'm presenting you both sides, and you can do with that what you will.
Talk to me a little bit about how the market of coffee as a commodity is significantly different to thinking about it as a everyday product that we consume. Does that question make sense?
Sure.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's sort of two different perspectives, right? You've got there's plenty of different perspectives on it, but I think what you're kind of getting at it is like, hey, I go into the grocery store or a coffee shop and I want to buy a cup of coffee, and I think about it as, a food item, essentially, that I'm going to consume. But traders look at it as a commodity. And it's controversial as a commodity. And a part of that has a lot to do with who the consumer of coffee is, right? And so coffee is like, if you think about your stereotypical barista or, coffee shop, coffee snob, right?
There's lots of them in Australia.
Yeah, they're all over. They're very socially conscious, right? They tend to be very progressive and forward thinking and all these things. So that doesn't necessarily jive with hardcore capitalism and free markets. So there is like some pushback there, and so that's why I say like the coffee trading world is like kind of this weird mix of these two sort of groups, because in some sense the consumer demands like a more compassionate, progressive supply chain, but that's not how traditional commodity markets work, right? So and if we think about the history of coffee, the history of coffee has always been kind of progressive, at least since the Enlightenment, right? When they first started coming up with these coffee houses, it was an alternative to pubs, right? You had pubs in the UK, and then say the 18th century or whatever, and then you had coffee houses, and these were places where, unlike the pub, where you get stupider the more you drink, and when you're having coffee with people, then like you get more and more wound up, right? So people would, that's why I sort of tongue-in-cheek say coffee is responsible for the Enlightenment, right? Because all these people were in coffee houses discussing these high-minded ideals and whatever. So coffee is a commodity, and I teach this in my course, and a lot of people in coffee don't like that idea. They don't like to say coffee is a commodity. They're like, no, coffee's not a commodity. Coffee is all these wonderful things, right? But it's not a commodity. Why do we say that it is a commodity? And I guess that begs the question, or raises the question, what is a commodity, right? And so a commodity is it's a raw ingredient to manufactured goods, and it's also uniform, right? So like gold is an example of a commodity, and gold is gold, right? So you can melt down gold and it's indistinguishable from other gold, right? If you think about agricultural commodities, you have corn, and when you're buying corn, you're not like picking out individual kernels of corn. You buy bags and bags of corn, right? You're like, it's all the same. I just want to buy corn, right, or wheat or whatever. And so, coffee is a commodity in the sense that when you're buying coffee beans, you're not picking out the beans, right? It's supposed to be to some degree indistinguishable. Now, that does not completely match up with what we think of, especially on the specialty side, right? Because if you're buying specialty coffee, then it's more like the wine analogy. Then you're saying, okay, I want a single origin Guatemalan, strictly high-grown coffee from the whatever region, the Huehuetenango region of Guatemala, right? And so then that is not a commodity in the sense that you can't replace that with a Vietnamese Robusta and say that it's the same thing, right? But they are commodities, especially if we look at, we have futures markets for coffee. We have a coffee futures markets, and that coffee futures market is created from a basket of eligible origins, eligible qualities of coffee, and so the futures market then represents essentially this basket of coffees that can be deliverable to the exchange. Now, one of the things that's beneficial about that, and in my class I use the example of gold and golden artifacts, right? So if you've ever been to Colombia, if you've ever been to
I haven't.
if you go to Bogota, the capital of Colombia, there's a museum there called the Museo del Oro. And the Museo del Oro has all of these golden artifacts from the Incas and the Aztecs and the indigenous peoples of those regions that were made, pre-Spanish explorers. And many of them were made of gold. Museo del Oro is, museum of gold, right? So the value of those artifacts is not the fact that they're made from gold, right? In many ways, the gold that's within the artifact is the least valuable thing about it, right? You could melt down this little tiny, Incan treasure ship that's, this big, and maybe it's worth $2,000 worth of gold. I don't know, I'm just throwing a number out there.
No, yeah, its value is the artificial scarcity of it being a piece of history.
Exactly, right? It's the artisanship, the scarcity, the history, all these different things. But it's still made from a commodity. But we can say that the value of this piece of art is we can isolate the value of that piece of art by separating it from the value of the commodity, if that makes sense. So just in the same way, we can look at that Guatemalan coffee I just mentioned, and we can say that is worth, let's say it costs $3 per pound. It's not what it costs, but let's say it costs $3 per pound, and the futures market is trading at $2.50. Then you can say that particular coffee is worth 50 cents more than the commodity, than the generic coffee.
So the futures market is literally bundling in all of coffee together. You're not buying specific markets of the Wawitanga high-grown Guatemalan coffee. You're buying just coffee.
Right. The futures market is a basket. So
that seems like such an inefficiency in pricing.
Oh, no, it's not at all. It's because it provides liquidity.
Okay.
So the reason that it's useful is because that's your baseline, right? So when you buy that Huehuetenango coffee or whatever, the reason that it's easy to buy is because of the futures market. So and some super specialty coffees have less of a relation to the futures market, but most of them have some relative correlation with it. Now, the reason that traders are successful and traders are a necessary part of the supply chain is because the trader takes on price risk that the producer and the consumer do not want. Okay, so the producer wants to sell their coffee for a high price, and the consumer wants to buy their coffee for a low price. And the way that that's possible is because of the futures market. So the trader will buy coffee from the producer and give them a high price and sell a future against it, right? So they've bought coffee and they've hedged it with a future. And then they turn around and they can sell that to a consumer of coffee for a low price. And the way that they do that is then at the lower price, they will buy back their short future and sell the physical. So the trader does not have any price risk themselves on the majority of that coffee because it's been hedged in the futures market. But because they were hedged, they were able to give a high price to the producer and they were able to give a low price to the consumer. Does that make sense?
Look, I don't understand the trading component of it. So although everything you said made sense, the overall idea of it did go over my head. So could you explain that last bit again, why say what it means that the traders provide liquidity and therefore what it means to be selling a futures contract, for example? I suppose, how does all this pricing work and so forth?
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, when you hedge something, you need to have a derivative, and that's what derivatives are for, right? Derivatives exist because of price risk. So this is one of the things I talk about in my class is I'm like, okay, in one sense, a derivative seems kind of stupid, right? Because you're like, it's an asset whose value is derived from another asset. So it's this one fake asset here that's value is derived from another asset. That doesn't make any sense. Why not just trade the asset, right? So in our case, we're talking about coffee. So we have coffee that's a real thing that people are buying and drinking, and that costs money. Then we have a future. And the future, the value of that future is based on the value of the physical. Now, why would we have that? Well, we have that because of price risk. So if you are a trader, your job is to buy really what you do, a big part of your job as a trader is logistics. What it is it's moving stuff from point A to point B. If we think about like ancient traders, right, in the Middle Ages or whatever, what do? They go from one place and buy stuff, and they bring it to another place and they sell it, right? And that was a valuable service, right?
Yeah,
that's really what traders are still doing, right? They're
especially when it's super high risk to transport things, right?
Yeah, well, especially now, right? That's a big issue. Yeah. But even if it wasn't high risk, right? If you were a roaster, you were thinking about opening up coffee, doing coffee business in Sweden. How, it is beyond your ability, at least in a cost-effective way, to know all of the different producers in Brazil, in Colombia, in Honduras, in Nicaragua, etc., and all the ones in Asia, right? So, even if you knew 100 of them in each country, right, which would be a very small percentage, like that's a lot of work for you. Or you can go to a trader and say, I want to buy Colombian coffee. And they can say, okay, which one do you want? And they have all the relationships, they have all the risk. But let's say you're a trader, okay? So your business is to buy up coffee from people who are growing it, right? And those producers of coffee, they want to get rid of it. They want to sell their coffee, right? They don't want to bring bags of coffee to Europe and like talk to every roaster there and say, would you try my coffee? And they'd rather have a trader there, with a warehouse right next to their farm who says, I will buy all of your coffee, bring it to me.
Yeah.
Right? So that's what the trader does. So if you imagine the trader, they've got a warehouse full of coffee somewhere. So if they buy that coffee from farmers and the price of coffee goes down, they've lost money. Right? So what the trader does is they buy the coffee from the farmer, and at the same time that they buy that, they sell a futures market, which is, you can think of it, it's not fake, but think of it as a fake asset, right? Mm-hmm. It's like an ETF or something, or, a stock market.
It's just whatever. A financial asset, financial product.
Right. That financial product makes money when the coffee market goes up, and it loses money when the coffee market goes down. Yeah. So if you trade an opposite position to your physical coffee, so if you own physical coffee and you've sold futures against that, if the price goes up, you don't make any money. If the price goes down, you don't lose any money. Mm-hmm. Now that's beneficial because you buy that coffee from the producer, it's hedged now, and then when the price of coffee goes down, you haven't lost any money, but you still own that coffee, and you can turn around to the consumer and say, hey, the prices are cheap now. Do you want to buy some of my coffee? And they say yes. So you sell them that coffee at the cheap price. And because then you just lift your hedge at the same time that you sell that to them. So I don't know if that...
No, that actually... Yeah. That explained it really well.
Okay.
For sure. If we're thinking more about trading coffee or the commodity market for coffee... your job, your competitive advantage, whatever, is just having some sort of good information or unique insight or very in depth. So I wonder what you think about how you can price in climate change into your strategy. So I know it's a big question, but how does the market respond, and how do you think about how the coffee commodity responds to the threat of climate change, both pricing in the potential future risk based off a model that has been wrong 100 times and might be wrong again, versus how it affects farmers versus the rest?
Yeah, I mean, climate change is it's one of those sort of controversial topics, and it's really only controversial, I think, because people get emotional about it. If we could just look at the data and talk about it and whatever, then like that would be fine. But it's not. I think people on both sides get very sort of like upset about climate change, right? But in general, I would say the people in the coffee industry are very, what's the word? Maybe I was going to say into climate change, but maybe that's not the right way to phrase it. They're very knowledgeable about climate change, and they are active in thinking about mitigating.
They have a big interest in understanding how it's going to affect climate. Yeah.
and it's very relevant to everybody in the supply chain, right? So if you need coffee, and we talked about where coffee is produced in the world, then if the climate is changing and the evidence seems to support that, then that's going to change the dynamic of where coffee is produced and how much it's produced. So everyone in the chain is worried about that and following it. Now, what is not clear to me is what can be done about climate change. And I'm not an expert on that, but there's no data that I'm aware of that says, like, if we do X, Y will happen. It's mostly like, we know these things are happening and we think that the climate is changing in this way, and we think these things are causing those. So the best we can sort of say is, like, if we stop doing these things that seem to be contributing to climate change, hopefully that will help, right? But we don't really have a number that says, like, we need to reach this level of emissions and then things are fine. to my knowledge, I don't think we have that number. And so I don't know what the industry is doing to combat climate change per se, although I know that a lot of the coffee companies and the trade houses have, net zero goals, and, they've got all they're aware of and part of the discussion. But I also know that at the producer level, the coffee industry has been very into the environment for a long time, right? You probably are familiar with Rainforest Alliance. That's a pretty old organization now, and I'm not sure exactly when that was started, but probably in the 80s. But before, or 70s maybe. It was before people were talking about climate change per se. It was more like that started under the kind of the Save the Rainforest type of movements. When people were concerned about sort of the slash and burn.
Classic environmentalism. People don't like seeing forests deforested.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But that's kind of become part of the the discussion on climate change too. Is like greenhouse gas emissions and plants obviously are part of that. I'm not a scientist, so I'm talking here, but I can tell you that those certifications are a big part of the coffee industry, and those certifications include a lot of environmentally safe practices. So that's grown from like a fringe part of coffee in the 90s to a mainstay of coffee now, where you've got fair trade, organic, you've got Rainforest Alliance, like all of these things, and those are putting on environmental standards, imposing environmental standards in cooperation with the farmers.
Since you brought up the Rainforest Alliance, I did have a specific question on it, because it basically comes down to how much skepticism should we have over the validity of a rainforest tick of approval, or a UTZZ certified, or a fair trade certification, or the no dolphins harmed certification. I read in a Starbucks, I was in Gran Canaria recently, so a Spanish island, and in the Starbucks there, it has proudly said on the wall, 99% of our beans are ethically sourced. And I get that that's a nice sentiment, but I was like, wait a minute, you're Starbucks. You're literally buying thousands of tons of beans a year. Are you telling me 1% of those are not ethically sourced? Because that's hundreds of small farms. In fact, that's hundreds of big farms. And so I heard that. And then there was another anecdote that a international journalist came on the show and spoke about cacao and the industry there as well, and how Nestle egregiously will sort of rope in a bunch of good suppliers into their supply chain and then a few really bad ones. But because there are good ones in there and they all go to the same warehouse somewhere, they can say this is this line of cacao. Anyway, all of that being said, as someone who has traveled the world to presumably hundreds of small farms now and hundreds of different warehouses, how much skepticism should one have over one of these ticks of approval?
That's a good question. I don't know if I can answer that directly, but I can kind of talk about it a little bit, in the sense that I think from the company's perspective, I mean, you've got a bunch of different perspectives, and one of them is the consumer, right? And the consumer's got a lot going on, right? When you go to a grocery store, how much time do you have to go? You buy some eggs, you get some milk, you get some coffee. Like, how much time do you have to investigate the source of all of those different things that you're dealing with in a daily life, right? Even if you think the eggs are pretty good, they've even got a stamp of certification on it that says cage-free eggs. Are you going to do your due diligence on that stamp? And go talk to the people who gave you that stamp and say, like, okay, well, what do you mean by cage-free? Because I've heard that when you say cage-free, that just means that it's still a mega farm.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like they're happy chickens. They're burning off the beaks or whatever, doing all these terrible things. So this consumer's got a lot going on. And so I think these certifications are a really useful tool for the consumer because it provides transparency and accountability. So they can look, they've got, they're one thing they can do is they can say, when I go to a coffee shop, I want to go to a coffee shop that cares about these things and has a way of demonstrating that to me. And one of the ways they can demonstrate that to you is through the certifications. And when you have a certification, we've sort of divvied up the labor. And the people in the world who care the most about environmentalism and fair trade practices and stuff, they go and work for these organizations, right? And what the benefit that those organizations provide, in addition to the actual work they're doing on the farm and with the people involved in it, is they are a third party, right? They're not the coffee company themselves telling you that everything's fine, right? They're a third party that goes in there and checks it. They have their set of standards and everything, and they have legal teams that will prosecute people if someone is using their, logo or whatever inappropriately or not living up to their end of the bargain. So at some point, you have to kind of trust that, and it's up to the consumer to say, okay, well, I'll do my due diligence on fair trade and Rainforest Alliance and stuff, and see if I agree with what those things are. But then they're doing me a service by putting their stamp on that bag of coffee, and then that's a shorthand for me to know, like, okay, I can choose this, and you'll have to pay a little bit of a premium to get it, but you'll do it. Now, to answer your question, how much skepticism should they have? It depends. In my limited experience in this, these organizations are quite thorough, and they care a lot about the outcome, right? They care about what it is that they're putting their seal of approval on, but they have specific standards, and sometimes there is gray area. Like, for example, child labor. If you have a farmer in Uganda, and he has a 2-hectare farm, right, which is not super small for him. For in terms of those farmers there, that might be a big farmer. So he has a family with a wife, and maybe he's got 4 children, and maybe he hires 2 laborers to help him. I'm just making these numbers up, but do we tell them your children can't help you on the farm? Because I don't know if you grew up on a farm in Australia, but I've got Australian friends who are farmers, and from the time they were a kid, they were helping on the farm, and that's sort of historically true. And then it's like, okay, well, it's one thing if your kids help you on the farm, but what we really don't want is to like pull kids out of schools, right, and have some kind of like horrible slave labor situation, right?
Because there are copious amounts of examples of that in corresponding industries. Famously, like the the sand mines of Cameroon are just littered with kids that should be in school. The cacao industry, even the banana trade, the vanilla trade. It seems like quite rampant, particularly in Africa. It's not just some guy's kids. It's
yeah. And you have camel jockeys, and you have child prostitution and all kinds of like atrocities around the world. And there's so I think I want to say in cacao it might be more prevalent, but and I don't my business is mostly on researching the global supply and demand of coffee and talking about the futures and options of it. I lived and worked in origin, buying coffee. I lived in Uganda for a year, and I lived in India for a couple of years as well, sourcing coffee and trading it. And so and throughout my time as a coffee trader as well, I've visited, I've done crop tours in numerous countries and many different continents. And so I have connection to it and I have experience with it. But I think that would really require some dedication and investigation to find out the answer to that question, right? Because on the surface, they're telling you it's not happening, right? I think it's a liability, and this is I think a triumph of the coffee industry in the last 30 years or whatever, is that, and I would say that coffee is ahead of most agricultural commodities in this sense that no one wants to be involved. It's a liability if someone finds out you have child labor in your supply chain. If you're Nestle, and it's not like Nestle owns these farms, right? But they might buy it from an international trade house, and this international trade house might have bought it from a local trader that sold it to them, and that local trader might have bought it from hundreds of different farmers. And if they find out somewhere that there was a child labor or slave labor involved in that, like that would be a huge headache for Nestle. Right?
Oh, for sure.
They don't want that. And that's really why we have this whole concept of traceability and certification, right? Because traceability is about exactly that. It's about following that bean of coffee from the coffee cup all the way back to the farm. And so a lot of these big, giant coffee trading firms have whole departments dedicated to traceability because they want to sell, when they sell their coffee beans to their clients, they want to sell to them a certified, this is true and you can count it and it's provable, that there's no nefarious activities going on with that. So that's a big part of the industry. Now, does some wiggling happen around with that? Yes. And I'll tell you where you should be skeptical about it and where there is a lot of wiggle room is if you buy Rainforest Alliance coffee, right? If you're a trader and you're buying locally from Rainforest Alliance farms, right? Now, there is some opportunity for the trader to be like, well, technically this batch here is the Rainforest Alliance coffee, but this other batch here actually tastes better, so we're going to just switch the labels on those two bags, right? Not saying anybody does that, but that is theoretically possible. It would be unethical, right? It would be kind of lying. But at the same time, if they've bought that coffee, it's almost like a carbon credit, right? It's like from maybe a less ethical perspective, you could say, well, on the net basis,
still did its job.
Yeah, exactly. I still did it what I was trying to do. But those beans that you bought that might be in your bag of coffee, even though it says Rainforest Alliance on it, could actually not be that other one. Now, I will also say that Rainforest Alliance and all these organizations have people that investigate this stuff, and they can go to the warehouse and look and make sure that it's happening properly. So there are sort of checks and balances on it, but that would be one way that someone could try to fudge the system.
I suppose, not being an insider or anything, but just from an outside perspective, I suppose, like you said, coffee's much better than a lot of other commodities when it comes to this. I suppose you could say anecdotally it's true. It's not like it's an illegal copper mine or a super or a horrible mono soy crop that required salted soil in a deforested Amazon to grow, or
right.
one of these, or just a a forest being chopped down for its wood, like in Romania. IKEA got into a lot of trouble recently because they chopped down this very, very old forest in Romania to get, wood. Comparatively, coffee might be good, but this also is a reflection of just, I suppose, most commodities. What about the environmental damage of a lot of coffee? Because just to say quickly, anecdotally, Nestle, who I think are net the largest purchasers of coffee in the world, they are putting pressure on this very small group of fincas in the southeast hills of Veracruz. And I was in Mexico last year with my mate who runs a coffee shop there, and we went up to see where he got his beans from. It was a fascinating day because these very small farm owners took us through, showed us theirs, showed us the corresponding properties, the difference in like the satiated soil, the difference in the land. One was a monoculture, one was a more wild forest-ish, not forest, but wild plants, and native plants stayed in the soil, created more biodiversity in the soil, etc. Basically just meant nicer coffee, but they were essentially getting priced out by Nestle because they would essentially make more money than what they do right now, which is just a little bit better than average. They would become rather relatively wealthy people because their land is worth a lot. And the environmental consequence of that would be that this very organic Arabica is going to be replaced by this very cheap Robusta because it grows faster and more reliably. And it will turn out crop after crop after crop until the soil's worth nothing, etc. So that's a lot just to say. If you could comment on some of the environmental damage of coffee generally, and like I said, I'm not picking on coffee. It's like you said, it's probably the best of all the commodities, but it's still interesting and I think inevitable thing to think about when you're preparing to speak with an expert in the coffee industry.
Yeah, I think environmental damage is also subjective, right? So, for example, let's say we're talking about wheat, right? If you want to grow wheat, you need a prairie. And like one thing I've heard is that like the Midwest of the United States there's almost zero prairie left. Like there used to be just prairies, and that was a habitat, right? It had biodiversity, it had sustainability. Like it would renew itself as a prairie, and there were certain insects that lived there. There were birds and fish and animals and everything that all were part of this habitat. And that's basically gone. There's almost zero prairie. I'm not an expert on this. It's just stuff I've heard, so I could be wrong on all this. So from that perspective, you could say that like the wheat is terrible, right? It's completely replaced this entire ecosystem, right? And so I imagine that there's probably wherever you're planting coffee, you're essentially replacing an environment, right? Like there was something there before the coffee. It might have been rainforest, or could have been just, mountainous environmental spot. So that's one area where there's really no way around it. If you have any kind of farm, you're replacing an environment with an unnatural environment that you're cultivating. Now, you have other environmental aspects too, like, okay, is this are we creating emissions, right? And most of coffee is picked by hand. There's very little farm equipment when it comes to coffee. The notable exception is Brazil, and that's because in these mountainous regions, you can't really just take your big John Deere tractor and drive it across it and pick the coffee. And even if you could, coffee is grown it's a berry, right? It's a cherry, so it doesn't ripen all at the exact same time. And so if you want to get the best cherries, what you do is you go through, you see which ones are ripe, and you pick those by hand. And those are your ripe cherries, and you have to go through several times to get all the ripe cherries.
That's crazy. I had no idea the majority was still hand-picked. It's crazy it's so cheap, considering that.
Yeah, well, and labor is always an issue, or often an issue, right? And that's why I think that might be why a lot of farms are small. 80% of they say 80% of coffee farms are smallholder farms. They're 2 hectares or less, right? So it's not a problem in that sense, I guess. There's not, except for Brazil, where you have big machines going through and doing this by machine. Most of the places it's by hand. But I imagine there's other environmental costs as well, like if you're putting in fertilizers and stuff that are not, that maybe there's water runoff or something. But that is also where the certification comes in, is that the Rainforest Alliance especially, but UTS and Fair Trade Organic, and these other things, they have standards on what are good practices for those areas, and what is the most sustainable and environmentally friendly way to grow coffee. And that really has to be driven by the consumer, right? If the consumer only cares about buying the cheapest coffee available, then that's what they're going to get. That gets passed through the supply chain. And if the consumer wants environmentally certified, environmentally friendly, ethically sourced coffee, then they have to buy that. I don't know if that answers your question, but
I wonder. It's also kind of like a harsh truth, isn't it? It's like, in the face of everyone complaining about the woes of the world, well, how much do you actually, vote with your wallet?
Yeah.
Is there any, you could apply the same to, say, fast fashion, arguably one of the worst environmental practices that has increasingly become worse and more prevalent as climate change has become more knowledgeable. So it's, it runs convex to each other, which doesn't make any sense. So is there any way, and I know this isn't within your specific realm of expertise, but I'm sure it's something you've thought about. Is there any way past that? Is there any way to ensure that I can't go and buy the cheapest, worst dried kilogram tin of Nescafe coffee at the cost of the environment, even though I'll happily drink that, at the cost of the environment? Is there any way to get past that where the only thing that we're shopping is actually good for the environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is. I think the example, well, you have sort of the top-down approach and you have the bottom-up approach. I am a, I'm a stereotypical freedom-loving American. I prefer the bottom-up approach. I prefer
the bottom-up approach.
Yeah, but of course you can always enact legislation, right? I mean, you can. But the problem with that, from my perspective, is that is the degree to which it's coercion and colonialism, right? Which is another problem. When I was in Uganda, people would burn charcoal and wood cooking fires, and a lot of Uganda is a crazy place, by the way, as an aside here, because the only white people in Uganda were either South Africans or they were missionaries or they were people from NGOs, right? And I mean, not the only white people, I guess there were others too, but by and large, that's what people came to Uganda for. Foreigners came to Uganda for. So and a lot of these foreigners were very well-meaning, right? They were very concerned about the environment. They were concerned about saving people's souls. They were concerned about, ethical, treatment of people. These were their priorities when they came there. But there's a level of hubris, I think, when you come as a foreigner to somebody else's country and you say, this is the way you need to behave because that is the proper ethical way to behave, right? And so, for example, I mentioned these stoves. And so the Ugandans would burn wood and charcoal in the stoves, and there were a lot of foreigners there who were concerned about the environmental impact about this and would lecture these Ugandans. And it's like, you spent, $500 on your plane ticket to get over here, and that's their annual salary, and you're telling them that they're burning the wrong kind of wood in their fire, to feed their kids. So we can, and I wrote an article recently called "Why Coffee Farmers Are Poor," right? And it's a big problem, and it's not a problem. It's not that we should ignore the problem or pretend it's not, say, oh, it's not our problem, it's someone else's problem. It's not that we should ignore it, not that we shouldn't try, but we have to be respectful, I think, of the complexity of the situation. And so, for example, coffee, as we mentioned, is a tropical crop. And so it's grown within the Tropic of Capricorn and Tropic of Cancer. And those countries, all of the countries in the world, and in my article I break down the per capita income of these different countries. All the countries in the world that are able to grow coffee are something like 5 times poorer on average than the what are they called? Temperate zone countries. Okay, just looking at temperature, not even like developed or undeveloped, right? Just looking at their latitudes and longitudes. And there is a tremendous burden on countries within this tropical band to develop. And if you think about it, like, for example, roads, right? If you've ever been on a coffee origin trip, you mentioned Mexico. I don't know how the roads were in Veracruz, Mexico. Maybe they were great. But in almost all coffee origins, the roads are terrible. Why are they terrible? Is it because there's stupid, lazy people in charge? No, they're terrible because you have monsoons every year in that region. And so there's essentially nature itself is imposing a tax on living in those countries, right? Whereas if you're in Canada most of the year, you have snow in some places, but otherwise, if it's just a giant flat, the Trans-Canada Highway is just one big flat temperate zone road, right? And so, a lot of technologies that have been developed in the temperate zones also do not translate immediately very well. You can't just pick up those technologies and use them in these other countries, So I guess my point is, the countries themselves where they grow coffee can make laws that say, like, no, they can make minimum wage laws, for example. But we can't just make a minimum wage, $100 an hour, or no one would be working in these countries, right? And so if we look at incomes of coffee farmers, and this is what I was looking at in this example here, one way of looking at it is like, oh my gosh, all of the coffee farmers in the world, most of them, 80% of them, are making like $5,000 a year, something like that. I'm pulling a number out of the air, but something that looks horrible to us. And not only does it look horrible to us, it's actually less than the average income in these countries, right? But does that mean that they shouldn't be growing coffee? Maybe it means they should, maybe we should be encouraging them to, and this is one of the things I sort of tongue-in-cheek suggest in my article, is that if we care about the coffee farmers, we should tell them to move to the cities and work for an IT company, right? Because then they'll improve their standard of living. But it's not that easy if you're growing up in a rural Colombia, right? Maybe coffee farming is a viable solution to you. Doesn't provide a middle class income by European standards, but maybe that is the best solution for you in your time, in your area. So look, these countries could make laws to say we're not going to have child labor, we're not going to have any environmentally unsound practices, etc. And I would think they would be in the best position to determine what the cost benefit that they could do for their people. And we could potentially in the West or in the northern temperate zones try to put pressure on those countries to change their laws. But then that goes back to the idea of colonialism. It's like, okay, we're giving you financial aid, but we're going to send an attaché there to ensure that you're doing what we want you to do and what our priority. And our priority in the West is environmental standards and climate change. And your priority in Uganda might be making sure everybody has enough food to eat. So it's a complex situation.
Yeah, and it's also kind of paradoxical, isn't it? I mean, the second Brazil has a high standard of living and the cost of labor increases in accordance with a high standard of living of a country entirely, because as the labor market becomes more competitive, because there are more job opportunities for people, they're going to start asking more for their... All of a sudden, 40% of the coffee market could get more expensive overnight.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, what are the downstream consequences of that? Does that mean people are going to stop buying coffee? Does that mean
I like to think that that would be
coffee
okay.
production moves elsewhere?
You mentioned Starbucks before, and in most coffee shops, most coffee sellers, the cost of the beans is not that much money, and they're just paying market value for the coffee, and that's a whole other discussion, I guess. But the market does what it does. When prices are cheap, that discourages production, and when prices are expensive, that encourages production, and that's kind of what we want the market to do. But if coffee became 2 or 3 times more expensive, that is not going to translate into 2 or 3 times more expensive for the consumer, right? Because if the price of a cup of coffee is $5, the cost of the beans might be 10 cents, right? And so if that doubles,
is it really that dramatic?
It's a very small portion of it.
That's what, 5% of the cost, or even less?
Yeah, it's something like that.
See, that's a wild statistic. I wish you had said that earlier. That's super interesting, right? To try and think about what this market is. Okay, but sorry, go on.
Well, but that's and that's it's a common thing that people talk about in the coffee industry, because they're like, oh, we're not paying the farmer enough. And this is another thing.
Seems like there's room.
There is room. There's plenty of room for it.
Yeah.
But the thing is, that it is not the job of coffee, and it should not be. This is my contention. It's not the job of coffee to provide people a living. Coffee is a commodity, and it's not to say that we should treat people badly or treat people unethically, but it's just like anything, if you might become, the classic example is someone carving vulture statues. You might really love carving vulture statues, but that doesn't mean you deserve to have a living selling vulture statues, and it is a problem. I'm going to sound like a complete jerk here, but it's not the market's problem what people's living standards are, and it should not be the market's problem. It's a separate problem, in my opinion. It's not that it's not a problem; it is a problem, and we should be concerned with how people live, right? And we should care about our neighbors and what their standard of living is. But you can't use that tool. It's not a tool that fits to deal with that, and it shouldn't, right? Because if you consider what I'm concerned with, and I don't mean like concerned like, oh, it bothers me, but concerned like that's my business, is like the supply and demand of coffee, right? And so if we tell farmers, we guarantee you not only a good living, or not only a sustainable living, but a good living. We promise you a middle-class lifestyle if you grow coffee. What do you think is going to happen?
Way more people will try to become coffee farmers, and it'll drive the cost of labor down.
Yeah, everyone's going to become a coffee farmer, right? Because why would I waste my time trying to grow something else if I can be guaranteed a good living as a coffee farmer, right? And this happens on a small scale, in all sorts of ways, because it's not that people haven't tried this, because roasters as I mentioned, the consumers do care about the producer of coffee. And there are some trade houses and there are some roasters who are like, I don't care what the price of coffee is. I will guarantee I will guarantee my farmers a living wage, right? And I'm going to pay for that, right? But if they do that, what they're saying essentially is first of all, they're going to come up with their own calculation of what a living wage is, right? And what their own estimation of that might be, right? And so they'll do some little calculation and say, well, I determined that the cost of production is $1.20 per pound, and I believe that most farmers are this size, and therefore I'll pay $1.50 per pound because that guarantees them a living wage income or whatever, right? And that's fine. That's totally within their prerogative to do that. But if they're doing that, what they're really saying is, I'm going to pay you for your coffee, and then I'm going to give you a donation on top of that. That is the X, right? And that farmer that sells them the coffee, they might be rich, right? But should we still pay them above the market price, like for that coffee? Or it could be, or then does the roaster then need to have personal relationships? And this goes back to like why we have a trade, to begin with. And the roaster is going to have personal relationships with individual farmers and say, I only buy from Ben. I only buy from Steve here and Judy, whatever. And they're my suppliers, and I know them and we trust them, whatever. But what if someone offers them more money? What if someone else says to Judy, hey, I really love your coffee here. I want to buy from you. Then that roaster's like, oh shoot, now I just lost my supplier, right? So they've got to go. So it's quite complex, I think. And I think what the market should do is regulate the supply and demand of coffee. That's what the market is good at. If we try to force the market to do something besides that, then it's going to fail. And it's not going to.
There'll be all types of unintended consequences.
Exactly. I would rather people say like, look, I'm going to buy coffee for whatever the price of coffee is, and I'm going to make it sustainable and certified and traceable, right? I'll follow these guidelines to at least, I'm not going to be contributing to any sort of unethical situation in the industry. And then I'm going to take a portion of my profits and I'm going to donate it to climate change organizations and rural welfare organizations in Colombia, for example. And those organizations, I think, are better suited to find problems in those areas and address them than just saying, I'm going to pay more money for my cup of coffee. So, but that's my probably unpopular opinion in the coffee market. There's probably a lot of other people in the coffee market who's like, no, Ryan, you idiot, you just pay them more money for the coffee, right? And other people are entitled to that opinion.
Well, I mean, it tracks with what you said. You're a classic free market guy.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the classic free market approach, as am I, largely at least. Obviously, there's exceptions. But if you think about how amazing it is that this one crop, one plant with several species, but one plant, which can only be grown in a very specific part of the world, as a cherry, can then be cleaned, dried, given to a giant market for different traders, exported, locally roasted, packaged, distributed, and almost, at least in my experience, I've never been anywhere where coffee hasn't been an option. That type of distribution and ubiquitous availability is so remarkable. So remarkable. And so, although it's kind of surprising that only 5% of the final product goes to the farmer, maybe that's the cost of having the coffee available. And it goes back to what we said earlier. What's an alternative to you just paying with your wallet? Like I was in, I already mentioned that I was in Gran Canaria. In addition to that Starbucks anecdote, I also just brought small vacuum-packed ground beans to make at home. And I was shocked. I was floored by the price. I think it was 500 grams. It was €2.
Oh, wow.
And I just said to myself, how many plants of yield was this thing I was holding in my hand? And it came from Africa. And it's €2. So I just couldn't believe it. But I guess it's a testament to how sophisticated the market for coffee is.
Yeah, I mean, and you think about it too. It's also what the market is trying to do when they're paying the farmers this prices. I think it does basically take into account the cost of production, right? You're basically saying like, here's the cost of production, and I'm going to give you a premium or discount on this cost of production based on whether there's a lot of coffee available. And right now, farmers are pretty happy for the most part because the price of coffee has doubled in the last year due to supply concerns. Right, there's been a shortage of coffee, and so the market has been going nuts.
Where's the shortage come from?
Brazil.
Why? What's
there
happened?
Was basically we had problem upon problem, but it was essentially like first they had droughts. Coffee is a biannual crop, so it tends to go. It's the way that we, as humans, we like to personify things. It helps us to understand them. And with coffee, the coffee has a good yield, a good year, and then it needs to kind of rest for a year, right? Because it expended a lot of resources to produce a big crop, and so the next year it has a smaller crop. So in general, coffee has this biannual cycle, especially in Brazil. And so last year we had a down year not last year now. It's consequence of getting older. I always think of but the 1920 crop was a down year in Brazil.
2020.
Yes.
Now you've gone back 100 years.
Oh, so
Oh, you mean 1920?
when you talk about coffee crops, it tends to straddle 2 years. So the 1920 crop is 2019, 2020.
My apologies.
Yeah. I was like, no, that's an important distinction. So we get used to saying sort of lingo-y things and forget, But at any rate, there was a down year. And then we had, so let's see, I'm getting confused here. The most recent crop was the 1920 was a down crop. Then 2020, we're about to have the 22-23 crop in coffee, which was supposed to be a bumper crop. It was supposed to be a big yield crop. Our last crop was a down crop, and that was supposed to be a down crop, but it was worse than people had expected because of drought, right? But the market was kind of like, okay, well, that's fine. It was down crop, but there's plenty of coffee around. We have stocks. We have inventory available. But then there was a frost on top of that, and that frost affected this coming year's crop, the 22 crop. And so now what was supposed to have been a really big crop is now a compromised crop. And so the market is kind of going nuts to compensate for that. But what I was going to say before was that when we think about that cost of that cup of coffee, like we talked about before, and how such a small percentage of it is going to the farmer, that is because there's a lot of costs in between when that coffee is grown till when it's served to you in a cafe, right? And so we like the farmer. People like farmers, right? That's why in the U.S., we always pass all kinds of laws to benefit farmers because it's romantic and we like them and they salt of the earth people and all that. And
yeah, 100%.
So
they have a cultural affinity in every single country.
Yeah.
The amount of subsidies that dairy farmers get is ridiculous. We're going to talk about commodities here.
Exactly.
Milk, it's ridiculous.
In coffee, we like the coffee farmers. We do. We care about the coffee farmers. We romanticize them. And I've known plenty of coffee farmers, and they are good people, and I do like them, right? And I want the best for them. But so we're always kind of appalled that they get such a small percentage of the total cup, right? But if you think about it, what's the relative cost of, say, growing coffee on a farm in Colombia or Ethiopia or wherever, and then also think about what's the cost of processing that. To process it, you need a large factory essentially with capital equipment, right? And you need people to run that. What's the cost of bagging it and the labor of taking that coffee once it's there and put it into separate bags, transporting it, putting it onto containers or whatever. and then shipping it, right? You had to ship it from, across the world, literally across the world, right? And then once it gets to the destination, you're paying taxes on it, right? Then it gets to the roaster. The roaster has the costs of, and now we're not in origin markets anymore. Now we're in a destination market, right? You're in Sweden. I would imagine that if you hire, if pop culture says anything to me, that if you if you hire someone in Sweden, you probably have to pay health insurance and pension and all of these.
Labor costs are huge.
They're huge, and probably.
And the tax to import it as well, actually. It's funny you mentioned Sweden. It's
real
kind
estate,
of absurd.
Right? Yeah. I don't know how much real estate is in Sweden, but if you want to have a roasting plant or whatever, you got to do that. And that's before it even gets to the cafe. Once it gets to the cafe, then that place also needs to pay rent. They have to pay their employees and pay all their health insurance and everything. And, you often give free milk. We talked about milk a second ago. You'll often give free milk and free sugar with coffee, right? But that's not free to the to the seller of the coffee, right? So all of those so you basically have two other commodities that you're giving away for free, in addition to this one that you're selling. So we look at the coffee and we think like, oh, why isn't the farmer getting more of it? But the all those other costs are also packaged into that cup of coffee that you get at the coffee shop.
Yeah. I'm happy you did that. You broke down the whole supply chain of it. Because it was, like I said, the idea is on ice. But when I was looking at it, I sort of just came to the conclusion that no one makes money in the coffee industry. Like perhaps the trader does. But from what I was looking at it, if I wanted to be a specialty seller, I didn't make any money. The roaster that I was speaking to and his anecdotal experience, they don't make any money. Basically, no one makes money. And just to give you a really tangible example, Company X, who I think should remain nameless, just in case, they roast they have the contract to produce all the beans for Espresso House. And Espresso House is the Scandinavian Starbucks. They have hundreds of locations, presumably have a required tonnage per day of ready to roast beans throughout Finland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, maybe Iceland too. Anyway, this very boutique specialty coffee brand who I was speaking with, he just said, oh, by the way, this is what we're doing. And he sort of was saying that alone wouldn't actually work as a business for them, because even at the tonnage that they are roasting per day, the margin is not enough to account for all of the different labor costs that go into roasting that many beans. And that was a real light bulb moment for me. Like, this is crazy. I think everyone in that whole supply chain just takes the thinnest razor margin, and whilst you can,
they do, and
rightly so.
The same thing with the trade, honestly, too, is because the trade is fungible. The trade is not. You think like coffee's a commodity, like. If you're a roaster, you do not care whether you're buying from Ecom, Neumann, Noble, Sucafina, whatever. Like they're all delivering you the same beans. Like you have no loyalty essentially to the trade house. And so commodities notoriously have razor thin margins. Because a commodity by definition is indistinguishable from any other commodity, right? So when I was in the trade, I remember one of my mentors there said, Ryan, if I make 2 cents of margin on coffee, then I did a good job.
Yeah. So the type of volume you have to do to justify that is
exactly
insane.
Well, that's why you have the history of the trade houses is interesting too, because and we're running up on time here, so I can't go too deep into it. But there's a good book called Merchants of Grain. Which talks about the grain industry, but it's analogous to the coffee industry. And what you'll find is that there's these family dynasties in it's one of the only industries that has giant corporate family dynasties, and the reason that is because these coffee trading firms all were founded in or many of them were founded in the mid to late 1800s. And that's because coffee is an international crop, right? And it's a commodity. So because of that, it required global companies and it required economies of scale, right? So you need people in Brazil, you need them in Vietnam, you need them in Ethiopia, wherever, and you need it in all the destination markets too. So in the mid 19th century, that was when technology was sufficiently powerful, transportation especially, shipping, you had railroads, you had, intercontinental travel was reliable at that point. Still took a long time. And so at that point, that's when these sort of global trade houses emerged and became these powerhouses because because the economy of scale was so important, that was what survived. And the reason they're family organizations is because these dynasties would essentially, they'd send one son to Brazil, they'd send one son to Switzerland, they'd send one son to New York or whatever, or a cousin or whatever, because you couldn't trust, even though there was enough reliability in the transportation, it still was, a month minimum, to get a letter from London to New York or whatever it was. So you would only trust your family. So it created these sort of family dynasties that lasted and are continued to this day.
Yeah. On the topic of good books about commodities, did you read The World for Sale?
No, I've had it recommended though. I'm gonna have to actually check it out.
As a commodities trader, I think it's probably required reading. But they mostly cover oil, obviously, which is just a whole other beast in its own right. Because something interesting about commodities as well is that, they're not just this sort of medium of exchange. They do serve a legitimate purpose. You take oil, it runs the world, right? You take corn, it is the base food for so many products. You take coffee, it's ingrained into people's cultures and people have it every single day. I drink shit tons of it. Most people in Scandinavia do. Really interesting. But like you said, we are coming up on time. I liked the fact 5% of the total, 5% of your latte is actually going to the farmer. The 40% is from Brazil, 20% is from Vietnam, the way Robusta and Arabica is split. Are there any other interesting facts about coffee that would surprise me and the listener?
Ooh, interesting facts about coffee that would surprise you. Well, there is there's an oft-repeated myth that coffee is the second most popularly traded commodity in the world after energy, and that's actually not true. I saw a study done that had it put it at the 22nd most popularly traded, but it is very popular, and the reason that it's popular is because it's volatile, and coffee is particularly volatile because it has if you go back to my economics 101 class here, it has inelastic supply and inelastic demand, because as we mentioned, it's a tree crop. And so if you want to increase supply, it's going to take you several years to get that supply increase, right? To plant new area and have those trees mature sufficiently to produce. Think about like if it was apple trees or something, right? And you want to create more apple trees, like you can't just do that overnight, right? And the demand side is also very inelastic. Like you said, you're probably not price sensitive at all to coffee, at least in the quantity that you drink. You might be price sensitive in like, okay, if coffee's $10 for a latte at Starbucks, maybe I'll brew it at home instead, right? But you're still going to have that cup of coffee, yeah. Right? So exactly. People tend to be very consistent in the amount that they drink. So if there's a weather issue, and coffee's dependent on the weather, then your supply will get thrown out of whack, and so you can have years of very high prices or very low prices, and that's why speculators love to trade it.
Nice. So that's a good one. Myth busting the fact that it's the second most traded commodity, because you do hear that a lot, don't you? Though I guess it makes no sense. Okay, well, I think Ryan, that was Ryan. It feels so weird calling someone else Ryan. I think that was very interesting. I'd love to leave you with two questions that I try to ask every guest, if you wouldn't mind. The first is if you could name a country looking forward into the future that you are particularly bullish on. And it doesn't have to be coffee specific.
A country that I'm particularly bullish on. It's funny because I'm so focused on the two that come to mind are the U.S. and China, but I'm like very hesitant there because I don't, those two are at each other's throats constantly, and it's not clear to me which one is really going to dominate in the near future, and you can make the case on both of them, and you could also make the case for both of them that they've reached their peak, and or are overvalued. So those are the two I've been thinking a lot about. The other one I think about all the time and am focused on so much is Brazil, but and I want to be bullish on Brazil, but if you know any Brazilians, they're famously bearish on themselves more than anybody.
Yeah, but Brazil's like the perennial disappointment.
Yeah, my brother called it.
People are always touting it to
tomorrow's world of the future. it's always tomorrow's world of the future. But
well, you've got to read Peter Zeihan, or at least watch a few interviews with him. He's probably your country's most famous geopolitical analyst, and it's funny. He gives quite a bad prediction for Brazil, but also an extremely optimistic one for the United States. And I'm about to publish an article called "Is China Doomed?" So, and it's mostly off the work of Peter Zeihan.
Have you read The Next 100 Years?
Yeah, by George Friedman.
Yeah. And he also did The Next 10 Years too, where he recanted a lot of that. But it reminded me of what you were what you were saying.
Yeah, well, actually, George Friedman was the mentor to Peter Zeihan. Stratford was like their geopolitical firm, and Peter Zeihan had now his own thing, Zeihan Geopolitics. But they pretty much have the same worldview, those two guys. But it's this notion that America, after World War II, ensured the security of international trade, which fostered globalization to drive down the cost of labor and transport, mostly internationally, to allow for the emergence of all these different markets. Because, as you know, so many markets. I mean, look at coffee. Coffee would not be as ubiquitously traded and available as it was if you couldn't safely get it from Uganda to Stockholm, right? And because the US dominates deep water transport lanes and routes and ensure the security of trade in these routes, it means that the cost of transport is much lower, and therefore all the unintended consequences of allowing for lower trade is what globalization is. And ultimately, because America ensures that, China is
it's interesting. I remember they were talking, because this came up, that sort of same concept, because you remember, like 10 years ago, piracy was sort of on everybody's mind again. We had all these like pirates in Somalia and whatever, and that was a recent phenomenon that people were sort of surprised about because of this sort of post World War II, Pax Americana. I guess we gotten a little spoiled, right? Not realizing that for most of human history, I guess piracy was a thing, right? And then suddenly we were surprised about it again.
Yeah, it was incredibly dangerous to just sail out into the ocean.
I was like,
but yeah,
go ahead.
Well, furthermore to it, basically, for the bearish case for China, is that they have demographic issues that are sort of beyond saving.
That's a good point.
They're the oldest population in history, and they're main reason for their economic growth was because they had extremely low labor rates, and that's why they became the manufacturers of the world. But as the middle class has risen in China, so has the cost of labor, and so forth. Therefore, they're no longer cost competitive on what has been historically the whole reason that they were so economically successful. So they have this very, very imposing bomb that's about to explode when
that's a very good point.
The oldest population in history retires, and the generation under them are not producing enough taxable receipts to be able to pay any sort of pension. And so you're just going to have a total collapse. They have one of the lowest birth rates in the world.
That's funny. I saw
there's myriad issues.
There's a guy I follow on LinkedIn. I think his name is James Eagle. But he does visualizations, data visualizations. And one of the ones that really struck me is that in a healthy demographic economy, you have essentially a pyramid, right? With the most people on the bottom are the young people, right? And then you've got successively smaller groups of people till you have a very small group of very old people on the top, right? And that's a sustainable demographic, right? Because you've got a large group of people coming in to kind of support the people that as they need it. And I think they said that they showed up China's pyramid was essentially inverted, right? Where you have the whole, you're going to have a huge band of older people on the top and a successively smaller
significantly more
supporting them on the bottom. And then you have also the male-female problems from the one-child policy as well. And
the split is 56-44 in favor of men. And in a country of 1.4 billion people, that translates to 40 million people. There are 40 million more men in China than there are women. And that's in itself just a completely unsolvable problem, because they also have extraordinarily low immigration rates. So you can't even bring in women for these people. It's a basket case.
That's also potentially, I mean, that's one of the scary things about China too, is that also makes a war almost what's the word, appealing for the leadership there, right?
Right. Yeah. At least go out on top.
Well, because you have to do something with all of these men.
Yeah. No, precisely. And and there's also a giant undocumented population in China. But thankfully as well, if you read or ingest Zihan and take his word for what he says, then you can sleep easy, because according to him at least, should a conflict flare up, the United States would be able to deal with them no problem. That's what he says.
Well, it's complex, and when I
but you used to serve in the military.
I was in the Marine Corps long time ago now. And I've got my old this little T-shirt up there. This is actually signed by Arlie Ermy, who, if you know who Arlie Ermy is, if you ever seen the movie Full Metal Jacket, Stanley Kubrick, he was the drill instructor in that movie, and so he was a real Marine. And Stanley Kubrick hired him to be a consultant for his actor in that movie, and to teach the actor how to behave like a drill instructor. But he was so good at his job that they just got rid of the actor and had him play the role. And so within the Marine Corps, he's very he was iconic. Unfortunately, he's passed away. And he was a big supporter of the Marines, and he came out when we were in overseas. I think that was in Bahrain during the Iraq War. So he came out to kind of support, for morale, whatever, and signed my thing. Mm-hmm. But when I was in college, I went to Harvard after I got out of the Marines, and I was a political science major. So that was I love discussing all this stuff here, and I took a class called The Future of War with a professor there. His name escapes me now, but he's been involved in U.S. policy for years and everything. And even back then, we were talking about different scenarios, and so this would have been early 2000s. And one of the big issues that was concerning was the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, which has come to pass now. That's become like something that is one of the geopolitical flashpoints, is these disputed islands in the China Sea that are essential for shipping lanes. But I forgot why I brought that up. But in that book that we mentioned with the next 100 years or whatever, they had talked about how the plan with China had always been kind of, at least from the Western NATO perspective, was like, okay, we welcome them into the World Trade Organization, we welcome them into the global economy, and as they get richer, they will liberalize, right? And instead, that didn't really happen, and that was what they predicted in that next 100 years, was that the east coast of China is very wealthy, and that as groups of people become wealthy, they demand more access to power, right? And so they sort of predicted this sort of breaking up of China. But I think what they didn't anticipate was how willing the Chinese party, the party is in China to or how important it is for them to maintain control. And they've really doubled down on all kinds of sort of repressive methods, right, or tools, in terms of social media and artificial intelligence and all of these ways. I just saw a podcast with General McMaster, who was the former who was he? Not Homeland Security.
He was like the head of the military,
national,
right?
Yeah,
Secretary
he was like
of State
national security advisor. I think he's national security advisor.
Yeah. Under Trump. Yeah.
And he's a nonpartisan guy. He's not much of a Trump fan either. But that's his business.
It'd be hard to be a fan of him after you work directly with him. From all
I would imagine so. But he was talking about how the threat from China is really
Totally. Guess we'll see. Required reading.
Right.
Peter Zeihan. I think you'll enjoy it a lot. Finally, Ryan, if you could witness a conversation... This is my favorite question. If you could witness a conversation between any two people in history, dead or alive, no language barrier, so if you could listen to a podcast, who are you listening to?
Jesus and Pontius Pilate. I want to see that conversation.
And Pontius Pilate. Okay, the nice one. That's a new one. Jesus is probably
Really?
the most common answer.
Yeah, take the wheel.
But yeah, it's usually Jesus, Buddha, something like that. But okay, yeah, interesting. So why is that? You just want to hear a discourse?
Well, I think it's a supply and demand. I think that's probably one of the most scarce interviews available. So I thought that'd be interesting. But I'm a student of religion as well. I think the Bible is just a fascinating book, and that dynamic was quite interesting one there. If you read the back and forth between Jesus and Pontius Pilate, because it was sort of like two ships sort of passing in the night type of thing, where it was like neither of them really wanted to be there. Pontius Pilate kind of was like, he didn't see anything wrong with this guy, and was like, I don't really understand why I have to deal with him, but I do. And Jesus obviously didn't really want to be there either, and there meaning in prison, so I think that would have been an interesting conversation.
100%. Well, Ryan, thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure, Ryan.
I get the sense we probably could have spoken for a bit longer, but I hope we did a little bit of justice to the coffee industry in that.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for having me. Hope this was useful for your listeners.
No, my absolute pleasure. I hope as well.
Bye.
Cheers. Well, that was fantastic. Thanks again, Ryan, for giving me your time, mate. For anyone who wants to start trading coffee, do reach out to Ryan on Twitter or through his business, the Coffee Trading Academy, which is coffeetradingacademy.com. And the links to both his Twitter and that website are going to be in the show notes, so you'll be able to access them there, no problem. If you liked this chat, I think you might be into some of the other more geopolitical focused episodes as well. So I can throw you back to James Robinson, episode number 24, the author of Why Nations Fail. Several with Tim Marshall, I think 13 and 31. He's the author of Prisoner of Geography and Power of Geography. But then there is also my most previous episode with Spencer Roberts on the degradation of agriculture worldwide. And so I know that we gave quite an optimistic picture of coffee here, but it is a part of this broader agricultural picture. And this chat that I had with Spencer really gives quite a depressing outlook on the food that we're eating, because the food as it's being grown in this giant agricultural complex. So help yourself to a healthy dose of that podcast. It might ruin your appetite, but it's kind of in line, those that I just mentioned, with the theme of today's show. But finally, my ambition for the podcast. I hope to corner the market for eclectic curiosities in whatever country it is that you, my dear listener, who these audio waves are coming through, massaging the lobes. I hope to corner the podcast market for eclectic curiosities in your market, whichever country it is you're listening in from, whatever state, city, ethnicity, demographic, age, gender, all of it. In your specific corner, I want to be the Eclectic Curiosity podcast for you and everyone else in the group. And to do that requires a lot more feedback into the algorithm. So I would ask that not only you leave a review yourself, not only you go into your Spotify, leave 5 stars, go into your Apple and leave 5 stars and a very nice comment, but instead you take it a step further. You grab your boyfriend's phone, your girlfriend's phone. You do the same with them. You start pulling people over as you walk past them on the street. Next time you're in a Zoom call with your colleagues at work, just stop what they're doing, hold up the conversation, and insist that everyone go and review and say really nice things about me and my podcast. That would be amazing. The podcast algorithms are in the stone age. It's the only thing they're paying attention to. So it's the best thing that you could do for me and the show. And so with that, I hope you really enjoyed this. And again, cheers to Ryan. And tune in again. See you next time. Ciao.